Christine here with a discussion about the Ogres in Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Certainly one of the more unique races in the game, and absolutely one of the best, and one of the most interesting one from a roster perspective, because things like lead belchers are a great deal of fun to use in battle. I mean, think of a guy carrying a cannon and basically using canister shot with it. That's essentially what lead belchers are. They're not an artillery piece, not in the way you might think. They're basically an ogre shotgun, and honestly, that's freaking awesome, regardless of how one might say it. And on top of that, ogres do have campaigns with Greases, Scrag, and Maneater that are very unique in terms of their mechanics. Greases is essentially the god of gold. Scrag has a lot of meat and a fairly dynamic starting position, and then we have Maneater, who's the world wanderer with his many ogre contracts. Of course, there are specific issues with that, but there is at least a great amount of uniqueness with the legendary lords. And also the roster in itself is very different than what you might see from other races in the game. Because, for instance, over here, turn 18, we can recruit man-eaters, iron guts, ogre bulls, Mornifang Cav, giants, yetis, gorgers, even saber tusks and blood vultures have their own role. So it's a very unique roster. It's more melee focused than range focused, but they do have some really good artillery, things like iron blasters, for instance, or an artillery piece mounted on a huge ass monster. And then when we consider the fact that your resources from exotic animals can also give you those awesome units at tier 3, Stonehorns with harpoon launchers, thunder tusks, and regular Stonehorns, is honestly pretty damn incredible when you think of the potential. That's one of the things that Creative Assembly did very, very well with Omens of Destruction. They vastly improved and made useful those kind of resource buildings for races like ogres and Khorne, to some extent even greenskins, but nowhere near as much. So you end up in the situation where resource buildings end up being very, very useful to have in an ogre campaign. Some of them more than others, to be sure, but consider timber, right? Reduction of construction costs by minus 30% for all buildings in a province. Or consider salt or iron. Those can also be exceptionally useful resources, or gang things like furs, which increase missile resistance by all your armies by 2%, and this stacks. So that is a great design over there, what they ended up doing. Now, ogres do operate on the basis that they don't really have provincial capitals properly. All they have are minor settlements. You can recruit things like Iron Guts and Lead Belchers, Gorgers, Giants, Yetis, and all of your heroes at Tier 2 and increased capacity at Tier 3. And by the way, it's kind of weird that we do have this garrison building over here, which is Tier 4. Yeah, Creative Assembly just mentioning that. I mean, what's the point in having a garrison building that you can't even construct? But all the same, the ogres do have a wide variety of choices in how they approach their campaign. Like, you can certainly make an ogre campaign work pretty well with just regular settlements, but obviously the main way you recruit units, though not heroes, though you certainly can recruit heroes as well, but the main way you recruit units are through the camps. Now, I have mixed feelings on the camps. I think on one hand, it's great to have the idea of a faction where your main recruitment centers are using their own unique resource. They only really use for that. Well, that and a couple of other benefits, but mostly for the camps. The downside is, even though we've gotten rid of surplus points, which do stymie horde armies, the downside is that, one, you have long construction times, and two, on top of that, the resource cost of meat is either very high early on in a campaign or irrelevant later on once you start getting a lot of meat. So I think some better balancing in that respect would have been better. At least in the way they were handled. Like, if camps required you to keep sending the meat for them to operate, I think that would be a much better system, or some kind of global system of meat where you needed meat in order to construct things, but you also needed meat to operate, including in terms of recruitment. I think that would have forced the player to do things very differently than they currently are, because right now there are ways to abuse it, like just recruit a lord always gets 50 meat when they're recruited, and you can just, transfer that meat to a camp, no problem. And you're incentivized to do so, because getting to tier 5 early on is not really important. You can win with just Ogre Bulls, but that's honestly a pretty boring army. And you do want to get a lot of these awesome units. That's kind of the issue, I would say, with Ogres. On one hand, the idea of having a faction that's just reliant on certain specific settlements that only they can construct camps, that they can then move around or, pack them up and move them up, that's great. The issue, I would say, is, one, you require meat, construction times are long, recruitment capacity is limited, and then on top of that, the recruitment time for things like man-eaters, or basically any unit that's not, say a Noblar or basic Ogre Bulls, is 2 turns. Well, Saber Tusks and Blood Vultures, of course. And that means you're just recruiting things slower. Now, Ogres are absolutely powerful, but it really leads to some weirdness in their campaign, like where the important portions of the campaign, for instance, me defeating Gorst and Kugaf over here, are mostly done with Ogre Bulls. I guess I got Iron Guts and Lead Belchers over here, but that's because I use global recruitment right here, and this is recent. I defeated those 2 with just a bunch of Ogre Bulls, and that's kind of an issue. Like, Ogres have an awesome army, but for the most part, you're just going to be spamming Ogre Bulls because, one, they're great enough, and you have a choice. Do I go through that micromanagement game of like, I'll recruit a lord in every province, and then I'll reskill them if they're higher than level 1, or just dismiss them, and then recruit more and more and more lords? Seriously, a lot of your early game money is going to be spent on that just to get the camps to have that awesome unit variety. So that is kind of an issue with regards to Ogres, because otherwise, imagine if we could play a campaign where we didn't have to jump through those hoops, and we could use things like Iron Guts and Ledge Belchers early on without having to do so. It's not like getting tier 3 units early on in a campaign is something that's unique to Ogres, right? Like, plenty of races can get so. Some can even beat them to tier 5. Think of Skaven, think of Karl Franz, for instance. But the issue is, like, the developers created this kind of annoying micromanagement game where really you kind of realize, well, why bother with things like units when you can just get heroes, since all your heroes increase at tier 3. Sure, it is a lot of money because provincial capitals do cost a fair penny, and the growth necessarily isn't the very best in the game for Ogres. So between the cost and construction times and all that, you do end up being forced to be quote-unquote slow, but when you engage in battle, it is freaking awesome. The issue is, due to the pacing issues of Warhammer 3, by the time you actually get to a battle with an awesome army, or even an army like this, which, yeah, it has Iron Guts and Lead Belchers, but really the mainstay of it are the heroes. And I just recruited a bunch of heroes here because, well, why not? Greasus gives extra unit capacity, and by the time all the things here are finished, well, I'll have 1. Sure, I could have improved my meat gathering capacity if I had fought the Skaven instead of bypassing them to deal with Kugaf. But again, that's kind of the weird dynamic in an Ogre campaign, really. It is easier with Man-Eater, because obviously his contracts give him a lot of money, and there's less of that micromanagement just simply because you have so much meat gained for contracts. Like, Scrag does use meat a lot more. Man-Eater just gets huge bursts of meat. Don't get me wrong, though, Scrag can get a huge amount of meat. Though the way he gains a lot of meat is you declare war on everyone around you, you let them come to you, and you obliterate them, and then bam, thousands and thousands of meat, however many camps you want, etc. Is not, strictly speaking, the best dynamic from my perspective, and I think that is where Creative Assembly could have been improving things. Mind you, ogres have gone from being easily one of the worst races in the game before Omen's Destruction came out to being one of the best. Their research tree has been vastly improved, though like with many research trees, you kind of realize that going for campaign benefits is just flat out better than going for military benefits, especially as ogres, considering like how damn powerful ogre units are by default. And also, if you just spend a bit of meat in every army, you end up being even more ridiculous, really, on that entire subject. So that is where I would say, again, balancing changes. I think like that's kind of the way you could describe Omens of Destruction. Great ideas, right? Amazing stuff. But on one hand, they created campaigns or reworked races that play very aggressively and have to. You do have to fight for meat. But on the flip side, a lot of things just try and slow you down, try and limit you. And I think that's always a questionable idea for developers to do. One of the reasons I keep harping on in videos about how Dark Elves are awesome is because Dark Elves don't have that damn restraint or any restraint whatsoever. They get slaves, they spend them on instant construction, they have good growth, they have good units early on, they have a wide variety of stuff early on, so all those systems just end up working, especially for Lokier at the moment. That's kind of the design philosophy that ogres could have benefited more from, but I guess Dark Elves ended up being something of a weird situation because they weren't intended to become like that. It just happened by accident, whereas ogres were designed like this. Like, I think that is the core problem with a lot of races. Now, that Creative Assembly is trying to have both things at once, like, you know, giving players awesome tools early on or a lot of power early on because it's annoying having to deal with crap tier armies very early on, but then trying to force us to play dozens and dozens of turns in a campaign. They're trying to do two things at once that just don't mesh well together. So that is one of the things. I would also say that having to assassinate a hero just for, or a character just for the sake of getting Bragg, who's by the way an awesome legendary hero, can be a bit annoying. Like, most of the time, like, I'm ogres. Why would I assassinate someone when I can just freaking throw my heroes into battle and kill them in battle? Like, maybe that should count for it. Legendary hero objectives can be silly most of the time. Like, oh, raid the province's corn. I've raised the entire province in a single turn. Why would I raid it? Just some ideas, Creative Assembly. So it's that weird mix of things. On top of that, I would say that the bounty situations, like you get a bunch of these random objectives, talking about the micromanagement aspect, you play a campaign and every turn, you probably are going to go into bounties and remove most of them, if not all of them, until you get something that you actually want, because most of these end up being rather useless. And you just keep re-rolling these. So the bounty system of like, oh, here's an objective. But the problem is the objective is on the other side of the map, or it's giving me a reward I couldn't care about, or it's pushing me to fight a faction I couldn't care about. I think Man Eater's system is substantially better in that regard, but that's kind of where I think they could have done a better job, where they could have gone with more depth for Man Eater than what they did. I know. Complaints, etc., but that's kind of the dynamic we're dealing with ogres. On one hand, you have a race that is amazing in many ways on paper, and it's almost amazing in how they play practically also. Like, they can be fun. They are fun, right? It's a shame they remove things like Wall Breaker from a good amount of units, which, yeah, that is a bit of a shame, really, when you're thinking about it's how awesome ogres are. Like, yeah, ogres used to be better in terms of sieges, but obviously lords and heroes still have wall breakers, so you still have that. You can still open paths in the game. I think that's the kind of trait that that Creative Assembly should use more, because it would certainly make sieges a bit more interesting. I emphasize a bit, not necessarily all the way. But regardless of that, ogres are kind of in this spot where they almost nailed it. They almost really did nail it. The uniqueness of the campaigns, the uniqueness of their playstyle as a race, the legendary lords, etc. But they just couldn't quite deliver fully. And I think that's probably how Omens of Destruction really ends up feeling like a DLC. I mean, Khorne and Arbol ended up being awesome for that, but even they have their own specific issues in the sense that they dominate everyone on the campaign map. And that's kind of the aspect with Ogres. If you can win with just Ogre Bulls, so everything else is pure fluff beyond that. By the time anyone can produce anything that can stand up against Ogre Bulls, and it's going to take a while, you can unleash tier 5 units and monsters on them that they can't beat. And again, that's one of the issues. I guess we'll find out how the end times ends up being handled by Creative Assembly. I do hope that they're not just going to be like, oh, here's a bunch of debuffs in these regions and you can't occupy them, and rogue armies and all that. So that's kind of the issue I have with, or my concern, if you will. Not issue because we don't know how it's going to be, but just a concern on how they're going to deliver that. Anyway, Christine signing out. Stay tuned for more.